So, Julie, I was hoping that we could talk a little bit about this question that I have for you, and it's: can you speak to the relationship between trauma, just generally, and spirituality?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of interrelationship between them. I think they're inextricably linked, actually. The way that I might frame it is the relationship between healing trauma or
Mm.
resolving trauma and spirituality. I think in a way they're both paths, if you will. We could say healing trauma is its own particular path, that we follow, just as spirituality is. And they're both moving towards finding ourselves a sense of wholeness, a deeper sense of wholeness, or finding out a deeper sense of who we are in the world. So they're both, I think, about uncovering what we are not to find out who we really are. And of course, they both look at it differently. And I was going to say, ultimately, they might have the same ending, but I don't think so. But I think eventually, resolving trauma may, right? Spirituality tends to have this aspect of deep awakening, or, the further end, it's been called enlightenment, dropping into non-dual awareness. I feel that if we continue to work with trauma, that's a possibility for us also, because we're working with, I'll just use the word, dissolving all of these layers of our false self or our adaptations, ways of being in the world, to uncover our core or our deepest self, right? Which is a form of awakening, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes me think of, that some Eastern traditions look at trauma as a catalyst or a pathway to spiritual transformation or spiritual growth. And, from the way I've kind of interpreted that is that it shakes our core foundation so much of who we take ourselves to be, that we're kind of left with this having to explore kind of a larger dimension than what we took for our personality or for our ego, or however you want to kind of frame it. Is that similar to how you kind of perceive it?
I'm glad that you said you hear some teachers saying trauma can be a catalyst to spirituality. I very definitely think it can be, just like spirituality can be a catalyst to us resolving trauma. I think one of the problems that I found with spiritual traditions or spiritual teachers, and this isn't across the board, but this is with a lot of people that I work with, is spiritual teachers are saying you don't need to do psychotherapy. You don't need to look at your trauma. You just need to drop into presence and non-dual awareness, and there you are. But really, we want to be looking at, if this is our natural state, if non-dual awareness is our natural state, what's preventing us from being in that all the time? There's something that's obscuring or eclipsing that. So I do agree with what you said, though. Trauma definitely is a catalyst of spirituality, especially if we look at spirituality. I don't think you can really define it so much, but I put this, I guess, definition of it. It's quite simple. So spirituality is about reconnecting to ourself, our core self, which then allows us to connect more deeply to others in a much more authentic way, where we're not seeing ourselves as separate, which connects us to the world around us. And then, if you will, on the farther reaches of spirituality, maybe the cosmos itself. I think both trauma and spirituality, in the way that they're connected, have the potential to do that.
Yeah, that's interesting, because now you're using these words about connection and reconnection, and you and I met through getting trained in the NeuroAffective Relational Model, NARM, and
Right.
the whole premise of the NARM approach for addressing trauma is really about addressing disconnection.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And it sounds like, that there's, again, this overlap between how trauma serves to disconnect us from, our bodies, our emotions, our core sense of ourself, and that we're using all these different strategies to try to reconnect. And often those are strategies that end up furthering our disconnection.
That's right. Yeah.
So it sounds like, some of the spiritual practices that you have studied and experienced and teach about are really ways of, offering this possibility of deeper connection.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another way of speaking about trauma and spirituality, how they counter each other, if you will, if we aren't resolving trauma, then we're preventing ourselves from knowing our deepest spiritual essence. Exactly because of what you've just said. We have all of these survival strategies and adaptations and ways of being in the world that really prevent our most authentic way of being from expressing, whether we know it or not. And spirituality also can be a means to do the same thing, that we can disconnect, if you will, into more spiritual realms or energetic realms and use that to avoid the distress that we're experiencing in the body or in relationship, which really the spirituality, the spiritual realizations are very real and valid, but they're disembodied, if you will, or they're discarnate. The deepest spirituality, I think, happens within our body. We have a body. We may as well come into it and experience our depth and our spirituality within it. And I think every tradition, or many of the major traditions, have acknowledged that over time.
So it sounds like you're speaking of what we might refer to as a form of spiritual bypass.
Exactly, yeah. And I know in NARM, in the book, it's spoken about very much with the connection survival style. So something that has more potential to occur in that first 6 months of life if we undergo some form of developmental trauma or experience threat, that we disconnect from the body because it's just simply far too much to bear or to tolerate. And so we have this amazing capacity in our nervous system to be able to disconnect in the face of threat. And unfortunately, though, we can continue in life. That's not the unfortunate part. Fortunate we can continue in life. Unfortunately, we can continue staying disconnected and not even know. And so, we have these ruptured boundaries. We may be in the ethereal realms and hanging out there and never really develop this strong core self that is really important, I think, in resolving trauma. This is what we're building, but also I think is really important in spirituality too.
So I know you speak a lot to different groups and individuals that are really immersed in the different forms of spiritual growth work. And what do you say to people that have gotten that message that you described before, that you just need to drop into dual awareness or deeper presence, and that can kind of move you through your trauma or your history, the challenges you've had in your history or your childhood? Like, how do you speak to them about how working with trauma can actually help support that? Like, how would you speak to the importance of that to someone that's more oriented towards spiritual process?
Okay. Well, usually the people that will come to me to work from, the spiritual orientation have actually dropped into presence, had some, very deep or profound realization. And it may have lasted for, a week, maybe the time that they were on retreat, months or even years. But at some point, something begins to eclipse that realization, and then depression comes up, or anxiety, and then shame because, this big vast spaciousness which they were begins to go away, and so they must have done something wrong. So all of these very old adaptations that somehow had been missed along the growth path come up. And I try and look at that with them as well. There were parts of your consciousness that were just not ready, where maybe the major part of you was to open up. I mean, presence is here all of the time. Our true nature is a constant. But something has come up to prevent you abiding in that continuously. So let's take a look at what that is. So then you heighten the potential to be able to reside in that space that you're so excited about, or your heart is so drawn to. And it seems to make sense. Like, okay, let's take a look. And we speak about it as consciousness, parts of consciousness that might have been frozen in time. And I know in the NARM work, we speak it, a similar language. So part of our child consciousness remains stuck, if you will. And so we want to try and access that and integrate it back into our system. And this is that part of coming back to wholeness. We're never really not whole, but parts of us, parts of our consciousness have split or fragmented and don't know that. So our work is to gather that and bring it back in to experience the wholeness.
That's fascinating. So I wonder if maybe we could move on to this next question together. And now that you've given us this nice overview, could you speak more specifically, because you're a NARM practitioner, NARM master practitioner, so could you speak to the NARM approach and how that intersects with the spiritual healing approaches that you're familiar with and work with?
I feel one of the most beautiful aspects of NARM and the spiritual healing is the cultivation of compassion, right? As we're working with our survival strategies and realizing that these are adaptations that we took on when we were younger and they begin to dissolve or disperse, they're no longer working for us, we begin to have this experience of why we became that way or why we took on that survival strategy. And in that, we can cultivate a sense of compassion. And I think part of the NARM work points to that. So that's the beauty, I think, of working with the NARM practitioner, is they are helping an individual recognize that, to help us point that out. And ultimately, we're hardwired for compassion. I think in a lot of the neuroscience and contemplative neuroscience work that's been done is if we just do a small amount of compassion practice, it actually cultivates very quickly within us, and the wiring for compassion in our brain lights up rather quickly because initially we are hardwired for that.
We're receptive for that.
Yeah. And so NARM very much does that. It points to the compassion within us and bringing that out first towards ourselves. And then once we have it for ourselves, then it's much easier to look back and see it for maybe the beings that hurt us or, what we've seen has been difficult in the world. We have this different understanding that's softer.
So developing kind of the loving kindness towards ourselves, and then as we develop that more towards ourselves, being able to share that towards the world.
Right, yeah, we're not projecting on the world our pain, if you will, or our suffering, or what we first experienced the world to be like. For some individuals, they might come in and experience the world as an unsafe place.
Yeah.
And at some point we realize, it's actually not. And we can have compassion maybe around the circumstances, not that it makes it okay, but that we see a much bigger picture of why the world might have unfolded for us the way that it did. And then I think another aspect, again, same as we spoke about earlier, is this coming back to who we truly are. Being able to express, be able to say how we really feel, without the fear that often gets too attached to something like that.
Yeah, and this actually speaks to the last question I wanted us to just explore a little bit together here, because one of the things that I think a lot of us who study NARM get really excited about is this possibility of not just shifting these old patterns that have kept us bound up with symptoms or old, negative behaviors or things that are getting in our own way, but it's also that on the other side of it is this freedom, this really incredible sense of personal freedom that is not limited by those old patterns that got developed during childhood. So I wonder if you had anything to kind of just add in terms of the NARM perspective on supporting freedom from our identity and our identifications.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There is a profound sense of freedom that happens when we release these identities that we've taken ourselves to be, right? that we don't have to have external things or people or ideas to prop our sense of self up anymore. You know, I think there's a great relief in not having to be someone. Right? From a NARM perspective, we have to be a certain way in the world. We think we do. We felt that we do to survive. That's what it comes down to. And we're always trying to manipulate the world in some way, you know, have people like us by being so extra nice to them, or, you know, surround ourselves with people who think we're wonderful. So, you know, we don't have to face our narcissism. Or there's so many different ways that are spoken about in NARM that we have to manipulate the world and manipulate ourselves. And I think it's exhausting. So when we release all of that, there's such a great sense of freedom. I love to speak about it in a way of surrender. And surrender isn't something that we can do, but we can have an intention to surrender. And in that intention, it can begin to happen. And I think it's a gradual process, which, you know, releasing our identities, I think, is a gradual process. We need to give it time to organize and to integrate and so forth. Yeah. There's a word in Sanskrit that for surrender, that means we give back to the owner what isn't ours. It's like we give back all of these identities that don't belong to us. We give it back to the source. So then we are free to be who we are. And then in that sense of self, a sense of agency that's spoken about in NARM is a wonderful free way to be in the world. And then we can take it further and shift our perspective from that individual self into something greater. But I think that first step is to free ourselves from identity, to find that agency, to know who we are and who we're not, in a way of surrender, of giving back what doesn't really belong to us.
Mm-hmm. So that's beautiful, the way that you just put that. I'm curious about when you're working with clients and they're moving towards surrender or getting, you know, to that place of increasing freedom from their identity. Often for a lot of people, that can be a scary place.
Yeah.
It can disorient people in sometimes a pretty big way, and feel lonely or alone, or just kind of overwhelmed or confused. And how do you navigate that territory where someone is moving towards something that does feel expansive and promising and growth, but there's also the fear or overwhelm that can come up in terms of releasing something that someone's relied on for their whole lives?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that's something that's really wonderful to explore in an actual session. So somebody can face that fear in a safe space with another while feeling connected. Because that's often where fear comes up when we're younger, when we're experiencing something that we call developmental trauma, where that sets in, we feel disconnected, and so the fear feels really overwhelming. So as we grow up and are adults and looking at these fears, if we can create a space that allows people to actually look at them and say, oh, it's actually not that scary. It was as a child, but it's not so scary now. And then they experience what we call in NARM, that sense of organization, that sense of softening, and can help a person really feel that as it's happening. Then fear begins to drop away. And what seems so scary and potentially overwhelming, they get a sense or an experience of it not being. It seems like it's going to be, but as I touch into it, it's actually not. Right? And that in itself builds agency. Oh, wow, I can do this. I think there's a lot of different ways to do it, but that's what just came to mind right now. We can keep exploring that because I think that's an important point, right?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, we talk about in NARM this, kind of like a growing up process of that. We individuate, we're separating and individuating, and that process continues throughout our whole life. And it just seems like this is the natural progression, that we start to individuate just from our own sense of identity. Yeah. And that, there's just this surrender, as you talked about, this opening that happens. And again, those are the moments I know for me when I'm working with clients or when I'm a client myself on my end of it, it is really exciting. And it does come back to what you first brought up in our talk here today about a reconnection. It feels like a reconnection, but not a reconnection to just our smaller sense of self, but a much larger, maybe Jung used to talk about it, some kind of collective sense of self or consciousness that we're a part of. That you use the word wholeness several times, and it does feel like you're starting to kind of reconnect to a larger whole.
Right, we're not just the sum of our parts, we're something that goes way beyond that. Yeah, I also talk a little bit about that from a spiritual perspective. I use the word we reconnect with our Dharma. Because Dharma has this sense of duty in it, but not duty to, how we might ordinarily think of it as a duty to do something, but a duty to our own being. And when we drop into our Dharma, it has this gravitational field that seems to bring circumstances, people, events that are in alignment, if you will, with our unfolding life. So we're no longer trying to grasp on to this and to that, to do something, to make something happen. But life begins to unfold, and we have a sense of who we are and what we want, or in NARM we sometimes speak about it as knowing our heart's deepest longing or our heart's deepest desire, right? It's often what gets cut off in childhood because of fear and disconnection. When we reconnect and have this sense of expansiveness, it's like the spontaneous movement of life and who we are just seems to come forth. And that's connected to, being a doer or no doer in spirituality. They say there's nobody doing anything. But of course, things are always unfolding. Life is always unfolding. So when we're in alignment with our heart's deepest longing, or we're in our Dharma, there's an unfolding, that is connected to something that's so much larger than who we are as an individual. But that individual sense doesn't go away. We need that as a reference point in the world, who we are, and a sense of self agency is important.
Yeah.
But we also, are so much more than that too.
Yeah. Well, this is just so exciting. I know we were only going to talk for about 5 minutes, but this is just such an exciting topic, and I hope you and I can have more conversations about this. But I really appreciate you taking time to share, your perspective, and you're offering so much back to our community. So really appreciate, what you're doing and taking the time to help us understand a little bit more from this larger perspective.
Oh, Brad, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to talk to you and to talk about this. I think it's an exciting field as trauma or resolving trauma and spirituality really come together more and are recognized that both are potentialized possibly when we bring them together in a healthy way. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks again.
All right. Thanks, Brad. See you.
Okay.